Maple syrup time.
This tree's probably been tapped a bunch of times, but I don't want to go in. Here's the one from last year. So now I'm in a situation like, well, where do I tap? The only thing I can do is probably come over here, and I want to go at least 2 or 3, 4 inches away from the last hole that was drilled, and either up or down from that hole. So as I look at this whole system, I know I've got a bunch of them tapped on this side. So maybe my best bet would be to go, oh, well, maybe I should maybe go over on this side. So I think, okay, this looks good. I think I'll drill in right here. I go in about 2.5, 3 inches. That's all I have. And look at how it's running. I like to keep it at just a little bit of an angle. You don't want to drill it like this because then it fills up.
Yeah.
It is pouring. Holy cow.
There.
Oh, there you go.
The one cool thing about having a bucket system is
Oh, buddy.
Suck
Sorry.
it right in.
It's okay.
Get some wood chips in your eyes.
Got my
It's
dog.
dripping.
yes. That's the satisfying part. Do you have a hammer? Or do you want me to pound it in?
Pounder. Get
All
it,
right.
Trish.
All right. Found it.
Now keep your fingers out of the way, though.
That's
Second tap on that one? Yeah.
Is that good?
That's perfect.
All right.
Now we gotta get the other side.
Drilling?
We'll have this type of it's kind of a fungus discoloration of the tree, and you'll see that on almost every maple tree. There's just a little bit of a dot here and there. Sometimes you don't have very many of them. Sometimes you'll see a lot of them. The older trees, of course, you don't see it unless you look at the very top wood. As soon as you provide light in a forest, there's all kinds of opportunities for another little plant to make it. It's unbelievable to watch this. There was actually a carpet of little maples when we first started out, and now we're getting to the point where they're starting to thin themselves out. There were just hundreds of them in here, and you go like, wow, but we have millions of maple trees. We're gonna be, whoa, you know? And then later on, you go like, oh, wait a minute, where did they all go? And the reality is that, well, some of them would be grazed because the deer would go through here, and other ones just lost out on the competition. Now what they tell you to do is you go in and say, oh, well, first of all, I'm looking for something that's not going to turn out too well and grow very fast. Here we have a tree that's already been injured, and it's got a broken cambium layer there. You can see on the side of it where there's some death to the core. And the biggest problem with maple trees is once you have that core open, maples rot pretty fast. cambium layer is the outside layer that grows every year. That's what they call the rings. As soon as that cambium layer is injured, like it is here, I don't know if it got scraped from a tractor tire or something that happened along the line where we maybe dragged a log out or something, and it got nicked. And of course, there's another example of it right here. Now this tree started to get a number of different funguses in it, and if you see, like when I take my fingernail and scrape, you can kind of see a little bit of a green tint there. What this tree is trying to do now is to grow a scab around this injury. And if you let this thing grow, probably if it was the middle of your lawn or something and you had only one tree and you want to spend another $40 for another one, you would probably try to help save this one. And what you do is you'd spray paint it to give a coating, but this part will start to rot. So in my estimation, I would say this tree has no chance to ever make it. And I'm a little worried because I can see some different types of growth that are happening on that bark. I'm wondering whether or not, well, maybe I should be throwing this into the sap tank boiler area and burn that up and get rid of that so I can kind of save my trees from something that might end up being contaminating. And then if you look at this area, you'd go, okay, so this area where Jessica's leaning against, you say, okay, that tree, that has a really nice crown that's developing. So in other words, the branches on the outside of that are starting to fan out and develop a crown to control light. And if you were here during the summertime, you'd realize that, boy, that's quite a shade tree there. And of course, that shade tree is taking away the light from this tree. And you can see how this tree is fighting for its spot, but you know it's not going to make it. Because there's already another tree next to it stealing the light, and you can see the crown developing past this crown. Yeah. This crown is not going to have a chance. It's going to be, within 20 years, this thing's going to be dead, and that tree's going to be mature. This system is all dependent on managing your fire and determining how much heat you have going with the amount of sap you have. Because if you're not careful, you can burn syrup really. I mean, it's surprising how fast that works. And you also, when you reach a specific gravity in the bottom pan, when that starts getting close to syrup, the bubble or the foam on top of that sap actually change significantly. The bubble gets smaller, and the smaller the bubble, the more it'll control and hold the bubble. So you'll actually, even when you're boiling, finishing syrup, you can actually get to the point where that bubble is so small that it supports itself completely up and will boil completely over. So right now we're almost reaching the point of boiling, and we kind of need to kind of watch this so you can kind of see. This is what pan cooker guys say. This is when you got your sap's got a cap on it. Once it starts boiling and breaks that surface, then of course that whole process is complete. But you can just see now where there's a couple spots where it's just starting to break that boil. This sap here was pretty concentrated because I'd poured in probably 40 to 50 gallons of sap on that top pan while I was waiting for this one to finish up yesterday. And we got off almost 3.5 5-gallon buckets of syrup. So it'll probably boil down to maybe 8 or 10 gallons of syrup. Hopefully I've got it down close.
Right,
now
we call this like near syrup.
Yeah.
It's kind of our word for it when we take it right off. It's not quite finished when you take it off this point. We're gonna take it up the hill and do a little more precise temperature monitoring on the propane boiler. But Rich was going to just touch on a couple of the imprecise methods.
When I grew up, I worked for a really large operation called Drury. The man who is the main producer of the maple syrup, who was in charge of the actual sap production, or maple syrup production, and boiling the sap. He was the guy that ran what they called the sugar house. And Charlie was his name. He was a character and a half. He could put his dipper in there and he'd pull it down and he'd pour it off and he'd watch the formation of the drip on the end of his dipper. And it had to stay pretty warm so you wouldn't be taking advantage of it cooling down. So he'd dip that dipper in 4 or 5 times in the hot syrup, then he'd pull it out and he'd pour it down and he'd hold it over and he'd watch the dip. Oh, no, you need about another 5 minutes on this syrup. You know, and it was unbelievable how accurate he was, because he would then take the hydrometer and he'd pour that in there and he'd check it and go like, oh, yeah, perfect. You know, and then away we go. And it was really surprising how well he did, but he probably produced in his lifetime, I don't know how many thousands of gallons of syrup. So he spent that was his job, and
Right.
he
So-
really knew what he was doing. I didn't. I was just
So these sort of imprecise, or these traditional methods that we're talking about, they really require a lot of practice and just knowledge and skill of working with the syrup, and people that have been doing it a long time can tell just by the way that it looks, its viscosity, which is its resistance to flow, and they have a feeling, they know when it's coming off, and that skill and that knowledge gets you the enviable title of sugar maker,
Yeah,
which
he's the man.
on our farm that's rich.
because nobody else wants to do it.
He's our sugar daddy.
So, but now we do have more precise methods to measure when the syrup is done and to calculate that. So one thing I want to talk about is the Brix scale, and it's BRIX, Brix scale, is the percentage of sugar in your solution. So the legal density of pure maple syrup is 66 Brix. So if we were going to sell this commercially, you would have to test it out, make sure that it was 66 Brix. And at 66 Brix, maple syrup is a stable solution, so it's shelf stable. If you're under 66 Brix, then you have the potential for it to spoil. And if you go over 66 Brix, 67 and up, then you have the chance that it's going to start to precipitate crystals and crystallize when it's stored for extended periods.
Right.
So you really want to be able to dial in that sugar content right around 66, because it's going to give you the most stable solution. So we've set up a makeshift sugar kitchen in the woods here.
That's we're boiling so that we can sterilize the jars.
So now it looks like we've got the jars have came to a boil.
Oh no.
So they are sterilized.
And if this kept going, of course, like they were saying,
Candy and stuff has been in the fridge for a week and it's perfect. Again,
you guys are getting the rustic made completely in
we don't sell it. We keep this at the end of the year before we boil again, because we are down to our last jars. The syrup. I try to not use too much refined sugars.
right here with crabs. This side or
Other side.
this side?
Yeah.
We could use the small.
Really tied it together.
Trade.
Hands on there. Pull them down and tight.
Yeah.
Remember to wrap these?
So this is the hot packing. You don't actually have to drop these in a water bath again like you would with tomatoes. You just heat up the jars and heat up the lid. Heat up the jars, heat up the lids, get the lid on there, tighten it down.
That can actually
Hopefully it will actually seal. We're gonna listen for the pop. I think once it starts to cool,
It'll be gone by tomorrow anyway.
it'll create that seal and you'll hear a pop.
I'm gonna sip mine all the way home.
gallon of sap, you get 7 to 8 pounds of candy.
That's a lot of candy.
That's a lot of candy. And the molded maple candy has little to no free syrup in it. So I'll show you the jar that this is basically what I'm starting out with. You can see that there's a little bit of free syrup standing on the surface, but most of this is almost to dry sugar. It's very, very concentrated material.
Ooh, that's soft.
You can just stand by, maybe. Kind of come
Like a second ago.
No.
There's still some chunks in it.
Yeah.
So this is when it's already back down.
Nope, it's still coming up to temperature.
What are you waiting?
So
When do you stop stirring it?
you would stir it and up until it gets to 240, 235.
Okay.
Looks good. But you are starting to notice the foam, and as Rich sort of described earlier, at those high temperatures you start to get smaller and smaller bubbles, right? So that's one thing to look for. So we want to just pour it into this bowl. Now you're agitating those sugar crystals, and you're gonna help them along with that precipitation process. So we're cooling down, and so the solution is not going to be able to hold the concentrated sugar that's in the water solution right now. So what's going to happen is it'll start to precipitate those crystals. I mean, I think it's okay.
You okay?
Yeah, I'm all right.
Thanks, Tim.
This is actually helping.
Should we do a 10-second countdown when we get there?
No.
Why?
It does say to err on the early side, because once it starts to harden up, you don't have a ton of time. I can feel it getting a little thicker.
My brewery used to have like a, do you ever see one of those old containers that they used to use for oil that had a little spout that came down?
Yes.
It was like a pitcher, and she had it like, it was insulated.
Save the turtles.
Is that all? Yeah.
So cold for that.
Yeah, try that.
Kinda, yeah.
Just need to